Yes, everyone, this is Andre Bright taking over Artist for Artist. How exciting! So I am doing a talk today as part of the Yes Lee, what's going on? I'm doing a talk today as part of the takeover, and I'm hella excited. So I'm just gonna write a bit of a description real quick. I'm gonna literally give it maybe a minute, and then I'm just gonna start talking. Today I'm going to be talking about the power of dialogue for activism through arts. Yes, Lee. Yes, Ladybird. What's going on? And yeah, it should be an interesting conversation. Should be a really interesting conversation. I'll give people a minute to jump in. How's everyone doing? How's COVID treating you? Hopefully you're still as strong as ever. Still as motivated as ever, all that good stuff. Welcome. My name is Andre Bright. I'm going to be taking you for the next half an hour. I'm excited. So let me write this title. So today I am going to be talking about the power. Yes, Caramel Soldier. I'm going to be talking about the power of dialogue for activism through the arts. And then the kind of subtext, I guess, is how talks give me the tools I need to make the art. Long title, I know. I used to make a difference. Amazing. Welcome. How's everyone doing? I'm just going to get started, actually. Let me pin that so people coming in know what this is about. Okay, wicked. Welcome to my humble abode. My name is Andre Bright, friend of Artists for Artists, and I always appreciate what they do. For anyone who has never, I assume everyone here would know who Artists for Artists are, but they're dope anyway. So always been supporting artists, and I think it's an amazing platform that they do. And in a way, they kind of represent part of what I'm talking about today. But me as an individual, my name is Andre Bright. I run an organization called Become Immersive, and it used to be a performance. It started off as a performance. Isaac in the house, he's actually been part of one of the performances that we did, and it's grown since then. And talks are one of the ways I used to do that. Now it is an organization that is turning into a CIC this year, community interest company. And we are based in Sierra Leone and UK, and we do projects around the African continent and diaspora, and we create projects around identity, empowerment, and creativity. And we wouldn't be able to do that, I don't think, if I hadn't spent the time to really delve deep into what was the root of what I was doing. For me, what I started to do was to create pieces. I've always been in the background of other people's performances, which was fine. Like, I'm multifaceted in that sense. I just really love movement, so I could slot into most people's pieces. But after a while, I had my own story to tell, my own experience. And the experience I chose to take to stage was, I initially called it the identity and cultural displacement of the African diaspora. And it was the feeling of me being Sierra Leonean, but not feeling like a Sierra Leonean when I go over to Sierra Leone, but being British and not feeling British when I'm here. So it's kind of like that idea of where do I belong? So I decided to embody all those feelings and expressions and everything into a stage performance. And that stage performance was the root of what Become has now become. And just a quick story, just to give it a bit of a context before I get into the heart of the talk. And thank you, Ladybird. I know you've seen it before, and it's had a few iterations, and each one of them has been completely different because of the conversations I had between each one. So it started off as a one-man piece, just me and a drum. And I saw from afterwards, there were a lot of people who responded to it really well. So I did the survey and I was like, so what do people have in terms of this experience? Do people relate to it? From that question, I realized that it wasn't just an African diaspora scenario. It was also any kind of diaspora, or even if you're not diaspora, there are other elements that make you question where home is. And I realized the root of it wasn't necessarily about the root of it wasn't necessarily being about African at all. It's just about not feeling like you belong where you are. And that helped me communicate with a lot of different conversations. I decided I wanted to delve deeper. And initially, the idea was just to take themes from other people, because I'm not the only story who has this. So I wanted to find information or narratives from different people that I can feed into my art. So I created a platform. So I called it Become Talks. And every week for like 6 weeks, I think, we had a different part of the discussion, which was all about identity and cultural displacement. From there, I took hella notes, and I used that to influence the pieces I was making at the time. And for those of you who might have seen them, you would see how different each one of them actually is. And the more I gave these spaces for talks, the more I could find out where other people are, what their relationship with their identity is, and what the root topics within my pieces were. And that helped me really make progress, make a movement. And so the reason why I'm doing this talk here, and how when I was asked about Artists for Artists and they asked me what I wanted to do with where Becoming Immersive right now is, I feel like the talks are such a core part of what it could be moving forward, that I couldn't not talk about this idea of activism and really the value of art, and if you wanted to make a difference. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the purpose of art itself. So they say there's like maybe, give or take, like 5 different purposes. Depending on who you listen to, who you speak to, it might be slightly different. But there's ceremonial. So for example, if you're celebrating culture or religion or anything like that, there's artistic expression. So me as an artist, I just want to express how I'm feeling, not necessarily for a purpose. There's narrative. So for example, I want it to be a reflection of the times. I want people to know, almost like a documentation of what's happening right now. I might do an artistic piece about COVID and the lockdown period, for example. There's functional. So, for example, if it's a vase, and I don't want it to just be a functional thing, but I want it to be beautiful as well as functional. And there's persuasive. So if I have a philosophical view, political view, something that I want something to make you think as well as feel. Like, even with those 5, there's a lot to do with it. Right now, I'm really going to be talking about the narrative and the persuasive part of things. So everything I'm saying, there's a purpose for all kinds of different art, whether it's music, whether it's dance, whether it's literally painting, whether it's sculptures. But right now I'm talking about the ones where they're designed for a purpose. So for example, if I want someone to react a certain way, or I want someone to think or feel something, or I want someone to question something, I'm talking about that kind of art in this section. So anyone who's an artist will know, and anyone who knows me will know, I have a very specific view on the value of art. So I'm an architect as well. So when I look at all these kind of elements in the conversations, I often hear art being spoken about as if it's lesser than other forms of communication, other forms of industry, sectors, all that kind of stuff. And I beg to differ, because for me, I found that there is so much value in art. Like if you look at it in tourism, for example, tourism, like half of tourism, like the British tourism industry, is to do with arts. It's museums, it's theatres and all that kind of stuff in terms of the financial gain, the economy of art, but also in terms of impact. So if we look through history, there's a lot of times when political movements have started, not necessarily because of the people who were in charge of a country, but also because of the music that is being played, the art that is being made. And you'll often find, whether it's you're talking about Nixon's reign and all these kind of people, politicians often merge with artists consciously, because they know that they have influence over the people. And as a politician, not only are you trying to do the best for the nation, but you're also trying to win them over. and for you to win them over, you need to know where they stand. And art is a great place to look at that. I'll give you another example. If you were to look through history, tangible history, okay, so we've got books that you can read. You've also got sculptures, cave paintings, clothes, all that kind of things. Those are great representations of how you can track where people's mindsets were in a particular time. So, for example, I'm Sierra Leonean, right? So we have certain types of patterns that we have in our clothing, which can tell you which culture they're from. And those cultures can often be the reason why they're designed a certain way, reason why they have certain patterns is because they're telling a story, right? And story is always attached to narrative. Narrative is something that I feel like some of us let go of too easily. So we really need to take ownership of us, our art as artists. So we talk about influence. We also talk about connection and language. One of the other things I find about, before I even get to practically how to use talks to share your narrative, is the concept that for me as a human being, I've often come into a situation where I cannot express how I feel with words alone. Everyone has this, right? So there's gestures, there's sounds you can make. When you're frustrated and you don't find the words, you just scream. In the same way, art can be in a similar kind of way. So you as an artist, if you're creating it, you may have something you want to tell the world, and you tell it through your art, which your words can't fit. Not because you're not educated in the English language, for example, but maybe the word doesn't exist. If we were talking about love, for example, other languages have 10, 12 different words for love. We only have one. So if you want to express a certain type of love, maybe that can't work if you're just using the English language. So maybe art can help you do that. In the same way, if you're talking about pain, if you're talking about let's say, for example, if you were to take it into current day and you're looking at what's happening in America at the moment, you're feeling that frustration. Words may not be able to encompass everything you feel. So you might decide to turn it into a dance piece. We might decide to turn it into a sculpture. And that may be able to communicate more about what you feel and what you want to say than if you were to write a letter, because that may not be your gifting. But also, art is subjective. So you can also find that people who are on the other side you have 100 people looking at the same piece of art, and all of them will take something different, and all of them are valid. They're often a reflection of themselves, again, which is why you find often the people in power will often partner with artists, because they want to see what the people are thinking, what the people are feeling, and where their allegiances lie. So now we're going on to the idea of activism. So if the title of the talk, like I said, is The Power of Dialogue for Activism Through the Arts. So how talks give me the tools I need to make the art to make a difference, right? So if we're talking about activism, the idea is, at this point, there's been thoughts, there've been feelings, there maybe been discussions. In a way, discussion can be part of activism, but activism for me is when you actually do something about something that you see. Whether it's often it's like a social economic problem or a cultural problem or something like that, and you take action. That action can take form in any kind of different ways, right? Some people go marches, some people sign petitions, some people I don't know, they'll knock over a sculpture. Some people would rally people around to raise money for a cause. Some people would build a building. Some people would write a letter to an MP. Some people would do all kinds of stuff. Maybe they would design a building to create a safe space for you. Maybe they'll create an invention, something like that. There's all kinds of things you can do in terms of activism. Art is one of them. So let's say, for example, I want to talk to the people on the other side of the world, and I want people to say, I want people to know how I feel as a Sierra Leonean living in UK. So I'm going to myself now as an individual example, right? I may decide to use it as do it through the medium of dance, right? And a lot of people, when you say that, people might think fall anywhere on the spectrum in terms of how valuable that might be as a communication tool. But you put that dance, especially if it has no words, if it's literally just music or movement, should we say, you put that in any other context, people would still be able to understand, because the core of what you're talking about might still be there. If it's belonging, everyone can relate to that. And if we were to look at it in terms of a message, for example, let's say, for example, you decide that if you've got a problem with capitalism and you decide to make art about that, the whole concept of people being turned into commodities. If you want to talk about injustices around the world, you can do it through art. If you want to, another purpose might be just to raise awareness. People might not be aware that certain things are going on in the world, although that particular issue could be another person's whole universe. So one of the things that I found with my journey so far is that if we were to use that kind of idea as a meeting point, let's say, for example, we're talking about I don't know, theft of tissue paper, right? Let's say, for example, somewhere in the world this is a huge issue. Other people may not really know about it, right? But you put an art around it, and then you put it around the world, and then people will be aware of it. Now, what they do with it might be different, but the awareness is often the first step to any kind of change, which is the next point. So activism in general, the whole idea, I guess, is that there's something that you see that is wrong and you want to do something about. Sometimes speaking about it isn't enough. Sometimes you as an individual may not believe you have the clout, the power to change it yourself. Often you need people behind you. You need to start a movement, some kind of revolution. And I genuinely feel like if you look back, like Bob Marley is a great example of that, in terms of the impact he had on Jamaica and what he felt about the political system at the time and how his people were being treated. He put it all through music, and he was specific, not just about the Jamaican politics, but the American politics and the world politics and what was happening at the time. He put it all through his music. He put words to it. He put music to it, to the point where till today, people will still be singing these songs long after the people who were involved in it have long passed away. And decades into the future, they still will be doing that. And often, if you look at archiving as an example of to keep cultures rich, cultures alive, and also to keep narratives hundreds of years down the line, people might think to themselves, how could we find out what was happening in 1980 or something? And they might decide to look through music, and they'll take down the music, the written word, and they'll be able to find out exactly what the people were feeling by patterns in what was being released in that year, right? Maybe to a depth that they may not have found through other forms of art or other forms of documentation, right? So awareness is really important. Now going on to my own specific examples. For those of you who are joining in, my name is Andre Bright. I run Become Immersive, which is at www.becomeimmersive.co.uk, and we're basically an entity that looks at the African continent and diaspora and linking to them together with projects around identity, empowerment, and creativity. That's what we do. So the change we look to see is a way that we can all come together, because one of the things I find in UK, for example, and any of the diaspora, one of the problems can be losing your root to who you are, your core, what you've inherited, and having pride in that because there's a lack of knowledge in it. So a lot of that stuff is to do with that. And the reason why I'm saying that is because to get to that point, I had to hold a whole host of talks, because my own perspective was only my own perspective, and my first step was having to realize that. And so I had to realize that it wasn't just my narrative. Everyone's narrative is completely different. What I found is, for example, I was speaking to someone in Kenya who felt that he felt displaced because he was Ugandan, and the cultures were so different. And in my head, the concept hadn't even occurred to me at that point that you could have people who were within the continent who were feeling displaced from different parts of the continent, which gave me another level of what I was doing. And so the more conversations I had, the more I could explore within the same context, the same conversation. Things that maybe I wouldn't have come up with if I just relied on my own thinking. And it's the same as how if you have a conversation to have, or there's a world issue, and you only talk to your friends who all think the same. We call that an echo chamber, right? So often you can find a situation where you just keep bouncing around the same ideas until they're completely exhausted without really getting to the core of anything. And then you step out of that situation, you find out people don't think that way at all. So for me, it was really important, even as a validation tool, to find out whether the things I was talking about were something that it was just me, or was it something that other people related to? And if it was, what can I do about it? So I'll get to that bit in a second in terms of the actual turning it into action, which is obviously a core part of activism. But the first part I was going to say is that when I initially did my piece, it was literally just expression. You remember I told you about some of the purposes? Ceremonial, expression, narrative, functional, and persuasive. It was literally just expression. This is just how I felt, and I didn't actually consider that other people would react to it the way they did. It was only when I came out and people are like, oh my gosh, I felt the same way, and it really brought me to tears when this bit happened, and all this kind of stuff. And often it was from people who I didn't really expect would connect with such a direct, what I thought was specific story or narrative. And again, that opened my mind. And so the platforms, first of all, it's hard being a mediator. For anyone who's looking to create talks, you have to be able to bring yourself out emotionally, because you have to give part of your art away if you're going to do this, right? So this is like a warning, because I know artists, we wear our heart on our sleeves. We're emotional beings. We throw everything into it. But if you're going to do something for a genuine change, I feel like sometimes you have to let go of some of it for it to be part of the people's work. It may start with your own narrative, but for it to be able to pick up momentum, I found, for me personally, it gained more momentum the more people were invested in it, the more people's views were involved in it. One of the tools I used, like specifically to do with dance, is I stopped using music after a while. Like when I say music, I mean 16 bars, chorus, bridge, all that kind of stuff. I just use soundscapes, but then I use conversations. So I use the actual talks, I use the interviews back and forth. So I'd have a conversation with someone. So if he's still on there, Isaac, for example, was a good example. We sat there and we spoke for I don't know, like 10-15 minutes. That soundbite I used over just the general soundscape, and that became our piece. So what we did physically married to what the audience would see here through the audio, and it was literally just talking. We weren't doing poetry, we weren't doing some kind of freestyle bars or anything like that to make it sound or whatever. We were just talking. The reason why I'm saying that is, when it comes to us as being artists, there are 1,001 different ways. There's basically 8 billion ways for you to tell a story. There's a story for each person who is on the planet. That's my personal opinion. But there are certain things that can be threads that join them through. And like I said, talks are one way to find out what those threads may be that you may not have even considered, but you might find that you've been living through your whole time and not necessarily maybe had a word for it. One of the things I found in the talks was we would often be talking about the same thing, but there'll be something that someone says in a certain way that would be like a light bulb moment. It's like, wow, I hadn't considered that at all. That's exactly how I feel. Me as the host will be thinking this. I'd have to write it down, and sometimes that can become, like, with their permission, the name of a next piece. Sometimes I would bring them into the actual development process and say, look, we've had this conversation where we talked about this feeling. What do you feel when you see this? And I'll show them a little bit of something, a snippet. I'll see their reaction. I'll have it with a little focus group, all that kind of thing, before I put it out to the masses. So one of the things I talked about was action, right? So when it comes to the art, so we've talked about the talks. For me, I use them as a platform to see other people's narrative, other people's ideas, where they're at in terms of their emotion towards a topic, what their experiences specifically are, what their stories are. They might have a slightly different perspective. And what I found is having these talks is great if you have people of opposing views. It really helps bring depth. Like a wise woman once said to me that if you want to get to the depths of something, you want to actually tear it apart. So for example, if I come with an idea, I actually want you to tear it apart. I want you to find the holes, because otherwise it won't grow. And talks help it do that. Everyone's had a situation where they're writing an exam or creating a product or making a piece or something, and they're so into the detail that it takes someone from the outside to be like, oh, how come the light's not on? And you're like, oh my gosh, I hadn't even considered that. Something so simple, but I was so ingrained in my own experience within this piece that I completely forgot about everything else. And talks can help you do that. speaking about action, for me, talking about Become Now. So we started as a dance piece, and I decided I want to go deeper. So I created talks. These talks gave me loads of tools that I put back into my art, but I also traveled to Sierra Leone, to Senegal, to Ghana, to South Africa, to Uganda, and my experiences there gave me also tools, shall I say, or narratives or ideas that I hadn't thought of. For example, that I realized in those trips how different the narrative may be in the continent versus outside of the continent. And obviously I'm talking about my experience, but this might be your equivalent might be completely different, right? So if I'm a singer, I'm a musician, and I want to talk about women's rights, me as a man, I may not have a clue about how to start that conversation unless I speak to a woman and I find out how they feel about something. If I'm talking about I don't know, any kind of abuse and I haven't actually experienced it, or even if I have, it's sometimes good to create these spaces so I can find out how other people feel, so that I can use that as a tool to communicate that to people on a grander scale. And what we do as well in terms of that as action, once we create a piece, because action could be anything, like I said earlier on, but creating a piece might be one type of action, right? So now you have a product. Us as artists, depending on what level you are and how you perceive it, can sometimes be, this is my perception, we can sometimes be so fleeting with our art. We can be kind of like, you create this thing and then, boop, okay, we did it once, it's gone. But art can be so much more impactful than that. So if I create a piece, if I look at it as a product or a tool to create change, I treat it completely differently. So there are some art I do which I don't have that. Some art is just like, I just want to freestyle. Sometimes I just want to think of one word and I just want to dance with that one word in mind and see what I come up with. Sometimes I may not even put it out into the open, it's just for me. All right? But sometimes when I actually want to make a difference and I want people to be aware, or I want people to think, or I want people to feel something, and I get into the depths of it by doing these talks and I create a product, then comes the question of what I want that product to be and what impact I want it to have. So Rach says, identity is important. The valleys in Wales, we have 366,000 people moved to the area between 1841 and 1911. In the 1920s, we were beaten to speak English. And now we are only desired if we speak Welsh. Exactly. Identity is huge. I mean, identity is just one of the topics we could be talking about. But for me, definitely, identity is massive. And for me, value is just as important. Like, say, for example, us in Sierra Leone, we really value the English language, but we're a Commonwealth country. And for me, my question over there is, when I went and I was like, the first time I decided I wanted to do a piece where I spoke Creole, I didn't want to speak English. There was a woman who came out in the crowd and she was really emotional. She was like, it was beautiful to see Creole on stage. And for me, it was just a choice I made. But it was, in terms of the impact it had on someone else, it opened them in terms of like being able to connect with something, being able to be empowered by that experience, where for her, it felt like I was speaking to her directly, And it's interesting. You've obviously got situations like Toni Morrison was talking about being challenged about why would she be interested in putting other perspectives as the center of a story, and she said, well, you wouldn't ask someone who's white, for example, to write a black person's experience into their book. So why would you expect me to do the same? Like, in her way, it was her way of communicating her story, because it was one that hadn't been told before. For me, Chinua Achebe, if we're talking about literature, for example, was a great big shift for me when I started to read like Igbo language, for example, or Yoruba language in text, or Creole language in text. For me, it was completely different, but that's art. Like, it can change the whole meaning. For example, there might be a word that's used, or a movement that's used that doesn't have a word in English, but the people who see it can understand. Yeah. So again, when it comes to action, we're talking about with a direct intention to create change. One of the things I found is there's huge responsibility in this section of the talk, right? There's huge responsibility in creating something which can provide change. It's great to be like, okay, cool, I've opened up the gates, I've just said how I feel, hopefully people will respond to it. But what I found is often what we do, especially if it's something that's current, especially if it's something that speaks directly to an experience someone in the audience or someone who's watching later on might have, it can be triggering. It can be something that sparks conversation, and it's important for us as artists to be open to the idea that there might be a conversation afterwards, that it might not stop with our art, right? So we've also got to be committed to the journey. This is just my experience, right? This is not going to be everyone's, but for me, I've got to be committed to the journey. I've opened up this can of worms, right, with my art, where now I'm also creating platforms for other Africans to tell their stories. So for example, if I'm going to Sierra Leone, one of the things I did was I partnered with Yusufu Jallo, the Cowfoot Prince, and Patriotic Advocacy Network, which is a youth empowerment entity, really. They got like 500 members, and between us we developed a further addition to a festival which allows the traditional arts to be put center stage in a grand scenario. So one of the most prestigious event spaces in Freetown is now used for traditional arts, which isn't even taught in schools in the country. So they'd rather teach contemporary and all that kind of things in the dance schools, but not teach the traditional art forms which have meaning, which have messages, which have all this kind of stuff. So for me, part of my artivism is trying to give awareness of the value of these kind of things. And like I said, before I could do any of that, I needed a real grounding. Like I had to go through research and everything, because a lot of the times I was fortunate enough to have really powerful, really well thought-provoking people within the talks who just opened my mind in terms of history and the impact that art can have. And then I had to start going back and reading about all the artists and how they work, but also the burden of being an artivist. Like the pressure that brings, putting yourself as the person. You could easily, as people sometimes in our communities might say, why don't you let someone else do that? Why does it have to be you? You're putting yourself in danger, especially if you're speaking against current politicians or like current ills that are happening in the world. You're putting yourself in danger as a result of you putting yourself in the center of this conversation. But ultimately, if you don't, who will? For me, that's where I stand. And remember, this isn't for everyone. Not everyone is going to have a message like this. Not everyone, if you have a message like this, is going to want to communicate it through arts. But for those who do, I implore you all to consider as well the long-term game of this. For me, if it's worth creating a story through art in order to create awareness or create change, it's worthy of commitment to it. So like, for example, if I'm doing a show, shit, my G, it says, in your experience, how important was momentum to your active cause? Momentum being the rhythm of how everything came together. Is there such a thing as good timing when the message is so necessary? I think there is such a thing as good timing. I think for me, it's just consistency. So I felt like I couldn't drop the ball. I think a lot of the time, if you go to the core of a message, like say for example you have a talk, right, and it's about abuse, the core of it is often timeless. Like, so you don't have to necessarily wait for like a massive scandal to happen for you to decide that's the time for you to put that out. I don't necessarily think that necessarily has to be the case, but I feel like, for example, part of my piece just happened to come out around the time of Black Panther, and I feel like that created a space where people were already having these conversations about identity of the African diaspora as well as the continent, and it actually created a big conversation within like what the narrative is on the continent versus off the continent, and who respects who, and can you appropriate your own culture, and all these kind of things. Like, great conversations came from this idea of belonging. And for me, it did help it happening in that time. But I genuinely think that even if I did it now, it would still have a similar kind of impact. And I think if I did it before that, the birth of that Black Panther and all the rest of the conversations will only really make it stronger. So I think if there is a way to tie it in with something that's current, go for it, especially if that's the reason why you created it. But I think if it gets to a point where you feel like you're waiting for an issue or something to happen in the world, then I feel like just get it out there. Just get it out there. If it's worth saying, it's worth doing. Really. And waiting, sometimes the time may never come for you to feel like it's right, if you will. And one of the things I found is that as well with art, it can be moderated, it can be updated, it can be changed, it can be improved. So for example, my piece, it's gone through, I'd probably say about 8 iterations by now. And that was pretty much over the 12-month period. So it's constantly changing. There's always going to be, it's like if you write a book, there's always going to be a new edition. There's going to be new information that you want to input into it. There's going to be new perspective that you want to add depth to it with, and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's I feel like I've been talking for a little minute. It's 6 o'clock already, so I've been talking for half an hour. But are there any questions in the group before I go? I know hopefully I've answered the 2 that were there, or responded to the 2 that were there well. But if there are any questions, I can answer them now. While I'm waiting for that, since we're speaking about talks, there's also, I'm doing a talk at 6:30, which is on the Black experience. Shadid say, appreciate you, the consistency from events to pieces to then traveling is real journey. Thank you, man. No, I appreciate you, bro. Like, and if anyone knows Shadid, you know he's the guy. So mad appreciating all the way back to you. And yeah, like for me, it was just commitment to, and it was more for me. It was as much for me as it was for the people who were coming to the show. Like, obviously I wanted to do that to get depth and everything, but it was also my own personal journey. So I was invested in it. So, I mean, when my relationship with Africa, for example, now, and I say Africa consciously, not just as a continent, is because my trips to, like I said, South Africa, Uganda, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Ghana have all individually added different parts to my journey, which I use now when I'm making art. So now if I want to do like particular patterns on a skin, and I feel like there's a story I might want to tell, I might decide I want to use like Ankara or something like that, or I might decide there's certain tribes I wanted to depict in this particular story. Or I might want to go back in history and be like, you know what, I'm going to do a whole story about the Mende tribe in Sierra Leone, and their migrations and their battles and their wars and their kings and their queens and all these kind of things. I might decide I want to do a whole thing on agriculture, because I believe that food might be a way to change, being able to be self-sufficient in that can be a way to regain power and narrative. And so I'd do a whole piece on agriculture. But to do that, I'd have to do research, and I'll find myself something to read. I'll create spaces where people can talk about it, find out more about horticulture, find out more about traditional healing techniques with food, and irrigation and the impact of that. And maybe there's a way I can use the movement of the irrigation to create a motif, and then I put that into my piece. Do you know what I mean? So there's always a way for it to link into each other. But are there any other questions? Great question as well, by the way. And like I said, if anyone's interested in the talk, there's one, Become Talks, Black Love Live, and it's a safe space for those of African descent, and it's diaspora, obviously UK, the Americas, Caribbean, to have a space to talk. And today we're talking about the apology languages. So similar concept to the kinds of the love languages, but it's the apology languages. So it's going to be a great talk, and that's at becomeimmersive.co.uk/become talks. You go over there, you click, you register, and you join in. So Rach says it's great to hear about how the passion for change can voice the new opportunities through dance. Woo! I didn't even talk about opportunities. That's a good point, because one of the things I found is being the person to create the platforms has allowed me to be the person to create opportunities effectively. So, for example, when I created the new edition of the National Storytelling Festival with Yusuf Jallo and Pan, we employed traditional dancers to teach. We didn't want it to be like a situation where we just kind of gave money or whatever. We employed them. So we were like, look, here's a contract. We value what you're doing. We value the knowledge you have. We understand that you can teach them things that we can't. Us as foreigners coming from around here, because there's a weird mentality about people from England and America and stuff coming with all this stuff. It's like, no, we're coming to learn from you. You have something that's just as valuable, sometimes even more valuable than what we can bring. All we want to do is help you do that. And for me, there was huge power for myself in being able to do that, for my people, obviously. But also it meant that the kids were like, I mean, you should see them now. Like now we have empowerment seminars. They're starting their own businesses. They're creating their own platforms. They're creating their own dance groups and things like that, where we're kind of like mentoring them in terms of how to turn it into an actual product and a business. And the next step, obviously, is to get them partnered with international organizations so they can travel and be joined with the West African festival circuit and all these kind of things. But again, all of it comes back to that one performance I did, which actually came as a result of being of Artists for Artists, actually. So that it was an Artists for Artists platform that allowed me to do that, and I felt so comfortable I could just create this space. That this space was created where I felt like I was safe to just express myself. I wasn't worried about what people would think. I was literally just experimenting, just tried. At that point, no one had ever seen me perform something of my own, which had a meaning before. They'd only really seen me battling and all this kind of stuff. And then I came out with that, which was something that was evidently very different to what people thought of my personality. So it wasn't like the laughy haha kind of stuff. It was quite deep. There was a lot of narrative involved, and I loved it. It was amazing. So yes, just to recap, in terms of art, purposes of ceremonial purpose, artistic expression, narrative, functional and persuasive purposes. We talked about value of art and the impact it has economically, in terms of influence, in terms of connection, and as a substitute for literal language, and how you can express something that you can't really find words for. We talked about artivism, or activism really, but artivism as a tool, and the idea of it can be used for protest, for sending a message, for politics, for awareness. Yes, Munya, he said, yo bro, great talk, we need to catch up. I have a few people, me included, that are on the same page and would like to talk and see if we can help each other. Absolutely. Like at this moment, I'm just open to all kinds of conversations. So if there are other people who are like-minded, who are doing things, because I know you, Rizal, you do your pieces, and I think I've been blessed to see one, maybe two of your stuff. So it's been dope. And so yeah, I'm up for me, part of this whole journey is collaboration. So one of the other things about being an artivist in some way is that it brings the attention of other people who are on the same wavelength, and then you can connect, because in numbers we have more power to do something. Imagine one person telling a story, finding out there's another person who's telling a serious story, and they join, and then all of a sudden you have two networks and two pools of resources that can tell this story even better sometimes than it can individually. So yeah, if you like what I'm doing, what I'm for, you can go to www.becomeimmersive.co.uk, and that's for my project. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to www.andrebright.co.uk. Yes, Kwesi Johnson in the house, welcome. If you want to follow me on Instagram or Twitter and all that kind of stuff, it's just at Andre Bright, ANDRE BRIGHT. And yeah, man, let's just keep the conversation going. If I've provided value, hit me up in the DMs and stuff. Let me know what conversations you're going through, if you're looking to do talks and stuff, and how to actually implement them. For example, how to build a partnership with a venue if you need a space for a talk, how to get it so that you build a relationship so you have equal value in it. I really do believe in partnerships these days. Like, I feel like they're like one of the secret powers that I've come across over the last couple of years that have really helped me propel certain things. And yeah, just keep supporting artists for artists, man. Like, they're awesome what they're doing. And part of this takeover, I think we have Tuesday and Wednesday maybe. There's takeover, and I think the other two takeovers are mainly around movement. So there's stretching as well as knowing about the body. Let me see if I can find it. So if you go to their place, to Artists for Artists page, it's the scheduled takeover. Tuesday at 2 p.m. BST, there's BD Black Dance with Agatha, and she's doing a stretch class. And on Wednesday at 10 a.m. with Self, they're doing a Finding Power in Technique. It's going to be amazing. That's me, Andre Bright. Thank you very much for tuning in. Yes, Self, you're in the house. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's been an honor to take some of your time. I'm really happy that you spend time with me. And like I said, if there's anything you want to know, anything you want to share, anything you want to talk about, give me a shout. It's at Andre Bright and all that good stuff. I'm always here. I'm in the background a lot of the time, but I'm one by one starting to like address certain things and put my ideas out there. This is actually All Talk Fortnight for me. So for 2 weeks on the Become Immersive Instagram page, 3 posts a day is just going to be loads of content just to reach out to people and give people spaces to talk. But thank you so much, everyone. It's been amazing. Mad love, people. Bye bye.